find the button. Okay. Now, where did my Zoom screen go? Okay, there you guys are. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Future of Engineering Roundtable session. In today's particular session, the Engineering Business Sentiment 2024 Q2 study. We are going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today. But before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping announcements. For the easiest view, move your mouse to the top of your screen and select Gallery View. This will allow you to see all panelists. Your microphone was muted upon entry, but if you wish to ask a question or offer a comment, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer as many questions as time permits. This event is open to the media and the press is invited to participate, as with our other attendees, by asking a question through the Q&A chat box or the Q&A box. We are also recording today's event for future viewing and will be posted on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. If you require any technical assistance, please feel free to send a message to ACEC Research Institute privately through the Q&A box, and I will be happy to assist you. I do just want to take a moment and thank all of our supporters for making this research possible. I know many of you are on the call today, so I just want to give a shout out and say thank you. Without your support, none of this would be possible, and it is sincerely appreciated. We're going to go ahead and get started. Excuse me, because we have a lot to cover, and we have with us today Joe Bates, who is our senior research consultant at the Institute. He is the one responsible for creating and maintaining our sentiment study. Thank you to all of you who have been completing the surveys each quarter. Obviously, without your completion, we wouldn't have anything to report on, so really appreciate your participation, and please encourage your colleagues to participate in the coming quarters as well. We also have with us Thomas Grogan, who is going to join Joe today. Thomas is ACEC's Senior Director of Economics and Private Markets. And with that, Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm sure there are many of you who have watched our presentations in the past quarters, so welcome back. And to those of you who are new, we welcome you and thank you for joining. So today we're going to talk about 4 different areas. The first is, how is the economy doing right now, the US economy as a whole, and we'll talk a little bit about the engineering economy as well. After that, we will dive more into how is the AE industry doing, both from an economic standpoint as well as from our sentiment survey. So Thomas and I will present a lot of different information that both of us have collated together for you all today. And lastly, we'll talk about what does the future look like? What's going to happen the rest of this year and maybe even to next year? We will take questions at the end. However, if you have questions throughout, please feel free to type them into the Q&A. We typically will pause at the end of each section and answer any questions at that point in time so that we can make sure that we're answering them at a relevant time for you. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started on that first section, which is, how is the economy doing today? Well, so US GDP in the first quarter was a lot softer than what most economists had expected. I believe the consensus forecast was somewhere around 2.4 percentage points year over year, and we saw 1.6% year over year for the first quarter. That's what we call the advance estimate. It's the first of 3 reported readings on the first quarter that the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis will provide to all of us. So we'll look for the next update at the end of the month. It's just coming around the corner next week. We'll get that second update. I think the thing to look for here is whether that Q1 number is revised upward or downward or stays the same. Lately, they've been revising these estimates upward, but then the last time, I believe, what they revised Q4 down. Is that right, Thomas, or am I forgetting now?
Yeah, I think Q4 originally was closer to 4% in the original advance release.
So they had been tending to revise upward, and now recently, the last quarter, they've been revising downward. So we need to watch this trend. Now, you might think, oh boy, we're getting into softer territory. Well, that's intentional. This is what the Federal Reserve has purposefully tried to do, and we're going to talk about that more in a little bit. So this is actually a good sign overall, and we need to see some softening in economic expansion. We obviously don't want to get into a recession, but this is not bad news at the moment. We're actually a little bit happy that we're seeing this softening from the prior quarter. So again, keep a lookout next week and see if they revise that estimate up or down, or if it stays the same. The next thing I wanted to share with you all is the employment data. So last year around September, we started to see what we thought was a little bit of a slowdown after really, really good numbers, very strong numbers throughout most of the last year. But then in November, things just kind of shot back up again. And so this was, of course, something that's of concern because the labor market is very tight. And again, the Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates, trying to cool down the economy, trying to cool down the labor markets a little bit. And so the thinking was that it was starting to work perhaps last September, and now it was after that it was like, oh boy, here we go again. It's just off to a tear. So in January of this year, we saw 256,000 jobs. In February, 236,000, and in March, a whopping 315,000 jobs. So people were starting to get a little bit concerned here. And then, of course, April comes along and we had 175,000. So that's not a bad number at all. Actually, it's very good. But again, we're wondering if this is a sign that perhaps finally we're starting to see a little bit of cooling off in terms of the economy and the labor market, which is what the Federal Reserve wants to see. Because again, we're going to talk about those interest rates in just a moment. So Thomas, I believe this is your slide.
Well, yeah, I think this is a good look at. It's not just overall U.S. employment or the unemployment rate being very low, but also when we look at professional and related occupations, which is where the AE services industry falls, it's significantly low. I mean, really the lowest by sector unemployment rate, and it's speaking to the fact that you have really, really tight labor market in our industry, and even across the board, there's some variation, but it's still good, right, to have low unemployment, and this is almost extremely low unemployment, thus making it very hard to hire new people when there are very few out of work looking for these jobs.
Yeah, and this number in particular, Thomas, as I recall, it's been around 2%, up or down a little bit for the last couple years at least. So this is certainly not moving upward, not even slightly. Like we are seeing the overall unemployment number for the U.S. It's going up just a little bit. It was in the lower 3 point somethings, and now it's in the higher 3 point somethings. But this number has been consistently around 2 percentage points. So obviously we have a very tight labor market, whether it's within our own industry or the economy as a whole. And that, of course, is leading to wage inflation, which we'll also talk a little bit about later. And this is one of the preferred gauges that the Federal Reserve likes to watch when it comes to interest rates and what they're going to do about it. But this is more of an inflation measure. What I'm showing you here is consumer spending, and consumer spending, of course, makes up roughly 2/3 or 70% of the U.S. economy. It's the driver, it's the engine of the U.S. economy, and we're seeing consistently strong gains, and these are monthly gains. So these are very, very strong gains, what we're seeing here. And this is called the personal consumption expenditure. It's essentially what consumers are spending. Along with this report comes the PCE price index. And that's what the Federal Reserve likes to look at more so than headline inflation rates, which we'll show you those also in a minute. And what we've seen with the PCE price index is that the inflation numbers are 2.7% in November, 2.6 in December, 2.5 in January. They were starting to head down close to that 2%, but then in March they've ticked up to 2.7%. And again, I urge you to watch for next week, May 31st, when they will release the April numbers. And again, you want to look to see not so much what's happening with consumer spending itself. We do want to maintain strong consumer spending, but what's happening with that PCE price index? If that continues to sort of go sideways or even ticks up a notch, that's an indication that the Federal Reserve is probably not going to be cutting rates anytime soon. Another measure that I like to focus on is the labor force participation rate. I've been talking about this for a long time, and the reason it's relevant is that prior to the pandemic, you can see in February of 2022, we had 63.3% of available workers. These are adults who are able to work. 63.3% of them were actually in the labor market. And that obviously fell dramatically during the pandemic as people were either laid off or just, they could not look for work. They could not find work. People just were not able to work. It came back, shot up a little bit, but it has still not recovered. And what this means is that when you're talking about a labor pool of roughly 160, 70, 80 million people, a percentage point is a big deal. That's 1 or 1.5 million people that are not in the labor force compared to what we saw prior to the pandemic. That's a lot of people who could be employed in a lot of jobs. So this is something that's adding to those inflation pressures. It's adding to wage pressures. It's adding to the fact that we don't have enough available workers. So, that's something that we're still watching. It kind of goes up a little bit, then it goes down, but we still haven't recovered to what we saw during the pandemic. All right, so let's talk about inflation. What we're seeing is what we call sticky inflation, and we're going to show you some of those slides in just a second. But this is the first slide that I want to share with you from the from the business sentiment study that we conduct on a quarterly basis. We actually had exactly 650 firm executives reply and participate in this quarter survey. That's actually the most we've ever had. So a great response rate. And again, thank you all to those of you who are participating in the survey. We cannot report this data without your participation. So what we're seeing here is the net rating, and that's we take the percentage of positive responses, subtract the percentage of negative responses, and we get sort of the balance of the respondents. And in this case, the statement is, I'm extremely concerned about the impact inflation will have on the coming year. So if you reply positively, it means you're concerned. So these positive numbers mean concern. And we saw it take a little bit of a dip in Q3 of 2023, which sort of corresponded with what was going on with these inflation numbers we'll show you in a moment. But then it jumped back up as people realized, the inflation numbers are kind of going sideways. And then they ticked back down again in the first quarter of this year when the Federal Reserve started talking about perhaps lowering those interest rates. And of course, now with the recent data we're seeing, the Federal Reserve has sort of backtracked and said, well, not so fast. So that's where the question is, what's going to happen? Well, here's what has happened. We saw that inflation, and these are all items that includes food and energy, which tend to be a little bit more volatile. So we had a peak of 9.1% inflation in June of 2022. And in March of 2022, the Federal Reserve realized it needed to start raising rates. And so it started to do so. It was already behind the curve, though, because at that point in time, the inflation had already gone above what we saw at the peak of the financial crisis recession. So they were definitely late to act. And they ratcheted up those rates very, very quickly. And so in June of 2022, they were starting to increase the rates. And what happened was that we saw the rates, these interest rates, I'm sorry, the inflation started to fall very, very quickly, which is a little bit unusual. It tends to fall more slowly than what we saw. So that was really good news. And in June of 2023, last year, it hit 3.0%. Well, in July, the Federal Reserve made its last increase in the interest rates that they were charging, that they were setting, because they felt like, all right, we've got this under control. And it typically takes about 9 months for interest rates to work their way through the economy. Well, unfortunately, what happened is that right after that happened, the inflation numbers started going sideways, and they've been sideways almost a year now. So it's what we call sticky inflation, and this is now a concern. Now, when we look at the core inflation rate, we're actually seeing something fairly similar. It's not quite as dramatic as what we saw on the last slide, but when you strip out food and energy, because those tend to be more volatile, we didn't have as high of an inflation rate, and it peaked in September of 2022 at 6.6%, but it's been coming down much, much more slowly, and it's still fairly high at 3.6%. So, this is why we are wondering, what will the Federal Reserve do later this year? Before we give our thoughts on that, Thomas, I know you have a few slides to add to this question about inflation.
Right. So, with respect to your point of inflation coming down, I think it's important to note while it's coming down and we saw it decline significantly once the Federal Reserve started raising interest rates, it's still not at the optimal, kind of steady state level they want. And so, this chart is really highlighting what the change in prices, whether you're including the food and energy volatility or not, things are about 20% to 25% more expensive than 3 years ago. And I think that this is what is making the overall economic outlook and sentiment for the US at large somewhat muddied, because we have positive and strong positive GDP growth for 6+ quarters. Yet, when you look at the different consumer sentiment studies from the University of Michigan or whomever, asking folks, are you better off, today than a year ago? How do you feel about things? It's pretty low, even though we're at, arguably the lowest unemployment rate in, I think, like 22 or 24 years. And this is, one reason why is that, even though the overall rate of inflation has come down, prices are still continuing to rise at a much higher level than we've been used to for the past 25 years.
Yeah, and Thomas, I read an article just this morning about an analysis that was recently conducted, and I forget who released it, but basically it said higher income consumers are faring quite well. Like, they're not having very much difficulty absorbing these inflation, the cost of inflation, but it's the lower end consumers and even mid-income consumers are really being hit hard. And I think, to your point, if you see that, overall goods and services are 20 to 25% higher than just a few years ago, there's not a lot of people who have seen a 20 or 25% increase in their wages over the last couple of years. So I think that's a big concern, are mid and lower income individuals.
Right. And so, to that point, when we look at the PCE breaking down spending on goods versus services, we see that, goods prices really started to flatten once interest rates started to rise. that also kind of corresponded with overall supply chain pressures easing, but that has been fairly stable for the past, few years. However, the services line, our orange line, just continues to rise. And for households, spending on services is about 70% of their household budget. And so, this is kind of this real tough position to be in where, a portion of your monthly bill is fixed and not increasing in price. However, spending money for anything like doctor's visits and haircuts and also your coffee, paying for the wages of retail workers, service industry employees, that's still continuing to rise, and is part of the stickiness and challenge that everyone is facing.
Yeah, I think about this, Thomas, and like you said, there's a lot of real world things that are going up in price. And one of the things I notice is, like I subscribe to this monthly car wash because it's a lot cheaper, right? And I remember just a couple years ago it was $49.95 a month, and now it's $69.95 a month. So, again, I'm able to absorb that, but other people may not be able to. And those people who may be driving for Lyft or Uber or, doing other service-based gig economy, they're probably being hit harder in their pocketbook.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, thinking about these cost increases with respect to our industry, we're kind of seeing the same thing play out here when we look at the two charts I have. The one on the left is looking at non-residential construction costs, primarily on the commodity side. So the items being used in building a structure, such as the wood, the concrete, the steel, the nails, that increased significantly, up about 40% during an 18-month period when the pandemic hit, but is flattened and kind of even dipped down a little bit in terms of those costs, really no longer rising. On the right-hand side is looking at the engineering services costs, and that has increased, about 15, 16% since the start of the pandemic. And, this is kind of highlighting the challenge, and is a very big challenge in our industry because of the life cycle and timing planning for projects. So, in your example, Joe, where your car wash increased, $20, you have the option of canceling the next month, and you got hit with the $20 extra for 1 or 2 months before you canceled it. When you're committing to contracts and doing work over a 3, 5, 8, 10-year life cycle, and the price, is increasing significantly between when you signed the contract and, maybe 12 or 18 months later when a new phase of the project begins, that can be very problematic when you're doing your kind of risk escalation analyses.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about this. It's been a little while since we talked about it, but it's really important if you're an engineering firm and you're trying to build in escalation clauses to do your very best to account for the increase in wages in particular, which is most the biggest line item that a firm would have. And we're going to show you what data we've collected on wages a little bit later. So Thomas, I think the big question, and this has come in across the Q&A by a few people, the big question is, what is the Federal Reserve going to do this year? Are they going to reduce rates? Are they going to keep them this steady? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think they've been pretty communicating as transparently as possible that they're going to follow the data as it comes in, and that they're looking at a 2% PCE target. And, where we are today in May 2024 and what the rest of the year looks like, what will happen, they're probably not going to be cutting the interest rates anytime soon. I think when we did this webinar in November, we were pretty confident they'd either be holding or cutting rates pretty much by now. I would say that over the past few months, the risk or possibility that they might even raise rates, in the next 12 months has actually entered the conversation, because as we see here with our charts and data, like the lines aren't going down, right? We need them to be going down if we want interest rates to be cut, and they're not. They're moving sideways, or in some cases still continuing to climb. So I think, especially between now and November, there's not going to be any change, short of some sort of unforeseen, circumstance, but nothing in the other data we're tracking is kind of pointing to a serious economic financial crisis.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100% there. I personally, the way I'm reading the tea leaves, I don't see interest rate cuts this year at all. And I'm starting to think more than not that they might have to increase interest rates again. So if you're holding out on taking out a loan, or trying to get the capital for some projects, or hiring more people strategically, whatever that case might be, I'm not sure I would wait any longer. And if the rates do a dip down a little bit, I would take advantage of that. All right, well, let's start talking a little bit more granularly, Thomas, about how is the AE industry doing. So share with us what you've been tracking on your end of things here.
Yeah, so the AE industry has been performing, very strong. We did see over 2023 a little bit of a flattening during the middle of the year. However, the final quarter, had a 2.4% growth in total industry revenue, bringing the year-over-year increase to 5.7%. We could see, just looking at the end of 2023 compared to the end of 2019, total industry revenues are up around 21%. So, our sector, for a variety of reasons, some of it federal policy, the IIJA CHIPS Act, as well as, frankly, low interest rates during COVID and developers taking advantage of that, as well as other secular trends like reshoring. The manufacturing industry is, propelled and continued to keep this industry growing at a constant clip. But what we'll see is that total growth rate is coming down. And so that's something to keep in mind. And so, yeah, what we see here on our left-hand side is the year-over-year change in our growth rate. And, coming out of the pandemic from 2021 through the beginning of 2023, having, well over 8% year-over-year growth, getting as high as almost 15%. And then as 2023 was winding down, that year-over-year growth was coming more in line with our pre-pandemic levels of about 5%. And then what we see here on our right-hand side is the growth in the employment, and really a bit of a flattening since 2024 has started. We recovered, we see that little blip when COVID hit, and that was about a 5% drop in total employment, but we recovered all those lost jobs in about a year, maybe even less, 10 months, and then continued to grow really strong till about spring 2023, where we see a little bit of a slowing down, a bit of a bump, and really, something that we've been hearing, for the past 8 to 14 months is it's been hard to fill roles. And what we're seeing is there's also just we might be hitting kind of the capacity in terms of the available workers who can fulfill roles at our industry. As we think about that slide we saw earlier, where professional services has such a low unemployment rate, it's because you can't just put help wanted sign hanging at your coffee shop, or at your local job board. You're kind of looking for skilled labor with a specific background, and there's only so many people, so much supply available to fulfill these roles.
So a little later, Thomas, I have some slides about what firms want to do in terms of hiring, and they want and need to hire more people. But what I'm hearing you say is we've tapped out the supply, that there's just not any more people available. And what are some solutions for that, either short term or long term?
Yeah, so the challenge, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier on the cost piece, is that our industry uh, the is slow moving, for lack of a better term. Some of that is, think about these projects, right? Some projects take well over a decade to deliver. The skill and talent takes time to develop to get them to be productive. So the long-term piece is tough because we need to be educating, graduating more engineers when we look at the data there. Short term, and ACEC has talked about this, and I think it's one of our legislative priorities, is improving the H-1B visa program. Just for the US labor market in general, the increase of, available visas has helped with the labor supply, regardless of industry, over the past few years. So reforming that to allow for hiring of foreign workers will, in a short term, help fix this. Long term, there's more structural things that, we're looking into. And we've also developed a workforce committee, to look at these trends regarding, students, the future of America, getting involved and being interested in engineering at an earlier age.
Yeah, I think at the ACEC annual conference last week in Washington, D.C., one of the things that really struck me was the number of people, and this is all industries, of course, applying for the H-1B lottery, because as some of you know, it's a lottery system. And the number of available slots is about 25% of the number of people that are applying. So there's just, that is something that legislatively Congress could act on and could help the industry very, very quickly, even if they made targeted adjustments to the lottery. The other stat that I recall from last week is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Thomas, is it roughly half of the folks graduating with engineering degrees are students who are from other countries? They're not actually US citizens, and they would need sponsorship to be able to stay here in the United States. Did I get that figure right?
Yeah, I believe that that's pretty accurate, right? So that makes it tough, and that's a whole different visa, right? If you want to come from another country and study in the US, that's one visa that they have to go through a certain system to apply for to get to study here. And then if you want to work here, it's a separate visa. Your employer has to sponsor. And so yeah, I think immigration reform is really the only thing that's going to fix this supply challenge in the short run.
Right. All right. Well, so that's one big challenge that we're facing. On the other hand, we're doing very, very well. As you mentioned, Thomas, in terms of overall revenues, we're at all-time highs. When we look at the sentiment survey, current economic sentiment, we're seeing that not only are firm leaders and firm executives feeling more confident right now about the overall condition of the U.S. economy, but the sentiment towards the engineering industry as well as firm finances is as high as it's ever been. That those numbers, the middle and the numbers on the right, have been consistently high since we began this study almost 2.5 years ago now. But it is encouraging to see that sentiment regarding the U.S. economy has improved. We hit a low almost 2 years ago in Q3 of 2022, and that was at a negative 15. So we're definitely feeling much more optimistic and confident in the overall economy right now. But the industry is been doing well, and there's no change there whatsoever. Now, when we break these numbers down a little bit, and here we're just looking at the condition of your firm's overall finances, and we break this down by region as well as firm size. The full report has a lot more of these breakdowns for a lot of questions. And at the end of this presentation, we'll share with you the QR code for the Q2 report, which we've just released today. So what we look at here is the last 5 quarters of firm sentiment regarding their own finances. And then you look at the change versus the previous quarter, In the second to the right column, and in the far right column, it's the change year over year. And what we're seeing overall is fairly steady when you look at the top line numbers. But if you dig down a little bit, I always really like to look at the 1 to 25 FTE firm sizes and the 26 to 50. They're the smaller firms. 75% of ACEC members are in that under 75 or so FTE category. And so this is where I say, okay, well, we're starting to see a little bit of softening sentiment now versus last quarter, as well as versus a year ago in those smaller firms. So again, sentiment's still very, very, very high, very positive. But this is something that we need to keep our eye on just to see what might be coming down the road a little bit. And then when we look at sectors, and I know you'll have you have the next slide on this, Thomas. You'll talk more about some of what you're seeing on the sectors as well. But in the third from the right column, that's the current quarter. This is sentiment regarding each of these different industry sectors. The areas circled in blue are the top 5, and what you see there are transportation, airports, transportation, roads and bridges, energy and utilities, water, wastewater, all IIJA supported areas. So not surprising that those are the highest. Data centers is also doing very well. And then we look at the change versus last quarter, some minor decreases in a few areas, not too much to be concerned about there. And if you look at the change versus a year ago, still most of these are positive compared to a year ago or about the same. It's only commercial real estate that really is lower than it was a year ago. And of course, I think we all know about that. And I know you have some data to share with us on the next slide about that.
Yeah, so this is looking at construction put in place data year to date 2024 compared to 2023 over the same time period. This is looking at the engineering, architecture services, as well as the construction, the total value of the projects. And what we see is, in the top 5 sectors in terms of, percent change, manufacturing, highway, educational, seeing really strong growth. Some of that, as we've talked about before, is related to the federal programs, IIJA, IRA, as well as other investments there. The areas that are performing the worst, but still basically seeing some amount of growth, commercial, residential, lodging, things like that. I mean, especially the residential piece. They're much more susceptible to the impact of interest rate increases on the cost of financing, cost of capital. So, given that we've had interest rates as high as they've been over the past 18 months compared to the previous, decade plus, it's in line, but it actually is frankly impressive that residential has started to, going back to, I think, October or November of 2023, started to kind of turn the corner, I think, as basically household pocketbooks adjusted to the fact that interest rates are going to be higher. And so it really didn't have as much of a, frankly, dip or impact as, would have been projected given the increase in interest rates so quickly.
One of the other articles I read recently, Thomas, this was fascinating because, over the years, the average square footage of a new home has just consistently gone up and up and up and up. And just very recently, builders are starting to deliver smaller homes, not that small, but the average has actually gone down on square footage because they're realizing that consumers are kind of tapped out when it comes to what they can pay for their housing. So I thought that was a really interesting development.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another gauge of how well the industry is doing is backlog, and we report on this every quarter. Backlog has been consistently even. The median is 11 months. We do, of course, see smaller backlogs for smaller firms and larger backlogs for larger firms. But when you look at those breakdowns, again, they've been very, very consistent. So again, just another good sign that the industry is doing very well. Here we get to employment. And this is what I referred to earlier, that we still see that 9 out of 10 firms have open positions. This has been pretty much the case ever since we started this study 2.5 years ago. The median number of open positions remains steady compared to last quarter at 5. And of course, that varies by firm size. Now that the detail of that is in the full report. You can see that number, but here's another metric that we've like to capture, and this is the number or the percentage of open positions compared to overall FTEs. And this has also remained very steady, that about 1 in 10 positions remain open. And you can see for smaller firms, that is a higher percentage. A lot of that is due to the fact that they're just smaller firms. So if you have 10 people or 8 people at your firm and you've got 1 open position, it's a higher percentage. But nonetheless, we see that 1 out of 10 positions are open and unfilled. And what you were saying, Thomas, earlier is that we pretty much tapped out the supply. So it doesn't look like there's going to be a change in that anytime soon. All right, so let's go ahead in the last 20 minutes that we have talk about the future. And just a reminder here, please go ahead and put in any questions you might have in the Q&A. We're happy to answer them as we go along. But this is our forecast from last year. We released this in October of last year, and we'll be providing an update in October of this year. So we're about halfway there, a little more than halfway. And what you see is that in 2023, we forecasted the nominal output growth at 7.9%. Thomas's numbers are indicating that that's probably in the right ballpark. But when you account for inflation, the real output is a little bit lower at 3.3%. So that's why we show the two numbers, because we've seen inflation really eating into growth. So what you see over the forecast horizon is nominal output is going to moderate more to what we call trend, about 3% over time. And because we do expect interest rates, and as they have come down, inflation rates have come down a bit, we do expect that you'll also see that flatten out. So 2.5% perhaps in 2024, maybe a bit lower next year. So we'll see what the updated forecast calls for in October. And when we look at sentiment regarding the economy, this is future sentiment 12 months from now. We do see that it is positive for the overall economy, but it's dipped just a little bit in the last quarter for the industry as well as firm finances. Something that's really interesting here that we have to share is that this has not been a good predictor of what actually will come to pass. So it gives us a good sense of what firm leaders are feeling about the future, and that is obviously a little bit more tempered than current optimism. But when we get to the point a year from now, it's really not reflecting what our prediction was a year ago. So part of that is we're not very good at predicting the future. Part of it is the tendency in our industry, at least, it's been this way for the last couple of years, to be a little bit more reserved about what the future might hold for us. And when we look at firm finances a year from now, again, we're seeing that compared to the previous quarter, a lot of firms are a little bit more negative, particularly those smaller firms. Only firms with 500 FTE or more are feeling more positive now. So again, a little bit of an increase in hesitation and uncertainty, but we're still above levels from a year ago. So that's the good news. And when you look at future sentiment regarding sectors, again, we see that those highest sentiment sectors are, again, transportation and airports, roads and bridges, wastewater, energy and utilities, and data centers. The exact same 5 areas that we're seeing having the most optimism right now. But what's more interesting here is that we're starting to see, again, a little bit of softening quarter over quarter in terms of sentiment a year from now. And also in certain sectors, particularly the IIJA and other, again, federally supported sectors, we're starting to see some declines there. But the good news is residential and commercial and data centers and convention centers, all of these areas which were lower and negative in some cases are doing much better than a year ago. So a little bit more of an evening out of sentiment as we look towards the future on these sectors. One more slide I had to share with you before we go back to Thomas's slides is that the reasons why people are more pessimistic, why some people are pessimistic now compared to last quarter and when they're looking towards the future. So these are only among those who feel that economic conditions will be worse a year from now, but it's illustrative to see why they feel that way. Political environment and uncertainty is the number one concern, and it's the second quarter in a row that it's been the number one concern. And it's not surprising. This is an election year, presidential election year, so this is bubbling up to the surface. Inflation and rising costs, that you can see has gone down and up and down and up a little bit, as we already talked about. General economic uncertainty is number 3, but again, that's been fairly steady. Some areas that have seen declines in concern, workforce shortages and recession concerns, along with supply chain issues. So some real interesting data here that you can dive into more in that full report. So what are we looking at now in the future, Thomas, in terms of GDP? Again, this is one of those metrics we need to take a look at, and then inflation. So share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so this was basically, we started back in November pulling different forecasts as to how folks are thinking about GDP. And what has been interesting is that as we get further into the year, the experts are feeling more confident in a stronger or solid, robust GDP growth. So, taking NABE, Wells Fargo, some other banks, and looking at what they're forecasting as of end of April, May, looking at a 2.4% GDP growth for the year. That's improved, significantly since the November estimates. It also kind of looks in line when we look at your chart, asking firms about how they feel about the overall economy and the economy going forward. It seems to keep increasing each quarter. So I think that, a little bit is probably folks taking into account maybe they were too pessimistic over the 22-23 cycle. And when you look at the data, there's no reason to believe that a sudden crash or a decline in activity is going to happen, between now and the end of the year.
Okay, I think that's accurate. When we look at what the firm leaders said a year ago and 2 years ago, they were very pessimistic, but yet things have continued to improve when we ask, how do you feel right now? So very interesting how that's worked out.
Yeah, and so then, going back to a impact or driver of inflation, especially 2 years ago, was supply chain congestion, causing that impact to the price of goods. Even with all that's happened internationally over the past 6 or 8 months, we saw a little bit of a spike back up, but it's come at the beginning of the year, but it's come back down. So on the cost of goods front and this kind of global supply chain impacting prices, this piece seems to be pretty in a good place, right? So it's really that services piece that's going to be really hard to get down, and something you want to monitor.
Yeah, and again, this goes very, very nicely hand in hand with the reduction of the concern regarding supply chain that we see among firm leaders. So I think this is all very good news from that standpoint. When we look at backlog, future sentiment regarding backlog, again, very positive. It's been positive. So even though it hasn't changed, again, we haven't seen any real noticeable change in backlog. It's been very steady. At least sentiment is very positive that, hey, we think it's going to get better in the coming year. So regardless of the fact that it's staying the same, firm leaders are very positive about this metric. And then when it comes to hiring, again, the question is thinking ahead 12 months from now, where you think your organization will add or increase, decrease, or keep your FTEs about the same. And so again, we see that the vast majority of firms are saying, no, we anticipate hiring. And it's only come down just slightly here now. Again, in the last quarter, we've seen some declines, particularly in those smaller firms. So again, that could be the realization that there's just not enough people out there anymore. And it's just, we can't hire any more people. But it could also, again, be, well, we're going to be a little bit more cautious. We're not 100% sure what's going to happen over the next year. And we want to play those cards a little closer to the vest here. So in terms of wages, we asked this question in the second quarter of every year, and what we're seeing for the second quarter of 2024, we asked firms that, did your new hire average salary increase, decrease, or stay the same? 90% of firms said that they increased. So among those 90% of firms who said our average new hire salaries increased, what is that increase? And we're seeing 9% year over year. That comes on top of 10% year over year last year at this time, and 10% year over year in 2022 in the second quarter. So this is obviously a very, very difficult situation, as we were talking about before, that you all are feeling these wage pressures, and it's without more labor, people can simply go from one firm to another and to another to another and just rack up the wages as best they can. So that is certainly a concern. Well, what about existing staff? We're also seeing fairly steep increases in firm expenses. So 7% wage growth for existing staff. Again, this is on average across your firm. And that comes after 8% last year and 7% the year before that. So it's getting very, very tough to maintain these increases in salaries, especially as you're locked into some contracts and your escalation clauses can't cover these increases in staff costs. And again, by the way, 90% of firms said that their existing staff salaries increased as well. So one of the things that I think is really interesting as we look back at our historical data with the sentiment study, now that we have 2.5 years of data that we can look at, we have been analyzing that and seeing if there are any correlations to the macroeconomic data we shared with you, like employment, housing starts, inflation, GDP, etc. And what we're finding is that, yes, our sentiment study is a leading indicator of other macroeconomic numbers. So for instance, the current sentiment regarding the US economy, showing here on the right side of the graph of the screen, and future sentiment of the US economy, generally those lead GDP by 1/4. So what that means is if you're seeing an improvement in current sentiment, which we have been, that GDP will continue to be positive. And that is, of course, what we have seen as well. Future sentiment, again, we don't see the correlation between future and current sentiment that you would like, but future sentiment is very much tied to GDP as well. So we're feeling better about the future, and that tends to portend that the GDP numbers are going to continue to be positive. We see some of these industry metrics, our metrics, including sentiment regarding the industry as well as backlog. Those also lead employment, housing starts, housing permits, and inflation by 1 to 2 quarters. So again, our data can help give you a little bit of a crystal ball to understand what might be coming down the road in the next 3 to 6 months. So that's, I think, very good news, very helpful to understand that this data can help your firm plan for the future. All right, so Thomas, what's next?
Well, I mean, I think as we talked about earlier, there's a lot happening in our economy, mainly good, some of it challenging. And so we have, a strong labor force, meaning folks are employed, collecting paychecks, so they'll continue to buy goods. This also, as you pointed out, with the labor force participation means we're at a bit of a capacity. So the ability to grow by hiring new workers is a challenge. And inflation is still pretty sticky. So, I think there's a bit of a wait and see what happens, especially with the election coming in November, expecting the Federal Reserve to do any sort of, cut in the meeting before that, or even two meetings before that, regardless, is probably keeping it off the table. And so, we just kind of have to see what happens. But, from a data perspective, things are good and strong. So that's really it.
Yeah, we also ask a question each quarter about recession concerns, and that has been, the average likelihood of a recession among firm leaders has been decreasing. So I think it was third quarter last year, it was about 50-50. 50% felt, yes, it's more than likely than not. 50% felt it's less likely than it should or that it will be. And we're seeing now it's about 40% likelihood. So I do think people are feeling more confident that we won't have a recession. But I think the real question is what's going to happen with interest rates? Are we going to continue to be in a higher than we have been interest rate environment? Although, again, as you pointed out earlier, Thomas, historically speaking, interest rates and inflation right now aren't really that bad, right? Like on my first home mortgage back in 1997, I think I had a 7.5% interest rate, and I thought that was pretty good at the time. Now my house is refinanced at 2.5%, which is phenomenal. But I think we got used to having very, very low interest rates for a while.
Yeah.
So Thomas, are there any other thoughts that you have in the last few minutes that we have in the webinar? How can firms use this data? How can they prepare for the next year or two with the data that we've shared with them?
Yeah. So I do think, the information the Research Institute collects, breaking it down by firm size and geography, is showing a little bit of differentiation across the US. And I think that we would be remiss without saying, especially from my perspective, I'm looking at national things in aggregate. There are areas that, one sector such as manufacturing or healthcare might have a bigger impact or role in your state's GDP than the other. And I think for the smaller firms, especially the very small firms, they're really tied to regional, if not state economies. So keeping track of what the markets are in your area compared to what the markets are that we are reporting on in terms of, sentiment, I think is really something to consider, because, with the housing market in some areas, mortgages are at all 25-year highs, prices are at 25-year highs. There are some areas that really boomed during 2021, 2022, and housing prices are coming down now. Similarly, certain sectors, dealing with population growth that now has shifted, it might not be as hot as it was 2 years ago. So I think that's something to just, the firms, your local markets best. So I think keeping that in mind would be, helpful for you to navigate the next few years.
I think that's great advice, Thomas. Thank you for your insight. And I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie, and if she has a few closing comments, as well as that QR code for us to download the full report.
I do. Thank you, Thomas and Joe, for your great insights today and for pulling together all of this data. Thank you to our participants and those that completed the survey to be able to have all this great data We do encourage you when you see that survey for Q3, just to take a few minutes and help us complete it to continue to bring all of this great data forward. Also, thank you to the sponsors of the ACEC Research Institute. Obviously, we would not be able to do any of this work without you. We are very thankful to this group providing financial support to the Institute, and we do welcome others to join and fill this whole screen. So please reach out on behalf of your firm or you personally if you are interested. Lastly, we do have the QR code that Joe mentioned if you would like to download your copy of the new Engineering Business Sentiment. So if you want to just use your phone, capture this, it'll take you right to the report. With that, I think we are ready to wrap up. Thank you again, Joe and Thomas, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.